Good evening and welcome. Hong Kong reported 17 new coronavirus infections today, all of them imported cases. The youngest patient is just 4 years old.
Now, despite a lack of local cases today, worries are growing over a fourth wave of infections that has officials considering compulsory testings for all people with COVID symptoms. Caleb Long has more.
As the city braces for a possible new wave of COVID-19 infections, more voices are demanding mandatory testings. Former Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying has earlier suggested mandating a territory-wide screening by law to eliminate infections. Microbiologist Yuen Kwok-yung has a slightly different view, noting that mandatory screening for all carriers of mild COVID symptoms is necessary. Secretary for Food and Health Sophia Chan responded today. She acknowledged the importance of testing, adding that authorities are studying the legal framework to conduct compulsory tests. As for the scope of the mandatory screenings, Chen said it is still under consideration. The health chief has also asked private doctors to put in more effort to help eliminate the disease. She said private practitioners have so far handed over around 110,000 samples for testing, with 925 returned positive. She says she has sent letters to doctors urging them to give out specimen bottles even to patients who only displayed minor symptoms. Caleb Leung, TVB News.
A much-hyped travel bubble with Singapore is being shot down before it even gets off the ground. The plan would require 4 tests for COVID-19 to be completed for each round trip.
Tour agencies doubt the scheme will help revive the battered industry, and critics say the sky-high costs are too pricey for average travelers. But as Haley Zhou reports, the Commerce chief insists the plan should move forward.
Singapore is expected to become the first quarantine-free destination for Hong Kong soon. The announcement of the much-talked-about travel bubble plan excited many at first, but it could end up only benefiting well-heeled business travelers. Having to undergo 4 rounds of COVID-19 tests with a price tag of roughly $4,000 on top of other expenses, including airfares, could make such trips too complicated and too pricey. Steve Hune, the executive director of EGL Tours, wants the government to subsidize testing fees, so tourists would only pay a flat fee of $200 max per test. Everyone wants to make a step forward. Speaking on a radio program this morning, Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development Edward Yao said travelers can't be too choosy. If we are being picky, our counterparts would be picky. Then our discussions would come to a halt, he said. The government wants similar arrangements put in place with mainland cities as well as Macau. But tour agencies say the government's public gathering ban is another roadblock. For now, there is no legal basis for the government to waive the ban for tour groups. Yao says the government should work out such a regulation, which would also require them to comply with other infection control measures. Secretary for Food and Health Sophia Chan says her department is meeting with tourism industry representatives to introduce measures to minimize infection risks for travelers. The government is also looking into setting up a rapid COVID-19 testing lab at the airport. Haley Zhou, TVB News.
The government's flu vaccination subsidy scheme was rolled out a little more than a week ago, but already doctors and clinics are running out of jabs.
It's not surprising to see increasing demands for this year's flu jabs amid fears of both the winter influenza and COVID. But the bigger problem now is clinics are claiming they're already out of jabs. People came to this clinic in Mong Kok this afternoon only to find there are no more vaccines. This man says, back in the days when there was no pandemic, I didn't even have to make any bookings, but just walked in instead. He says he will try again later. This woman was told the same thing, but was given the numbers of other clinics, possibly with flu jabs still in stock, so she will give it a try. Under the flu vaccination scheme this year, seniors over 50, children under 12 and pregnant moms will get $240 in subsidies from the government to be vaccinated in private clinics around town. Private doctors may or may not charge extra fees. A family doctor says there are lots of concerns.
People are just a bit anxious and rushing for the vaccination. And in the past few years, I usually vaccinate people, about 500 people a month. But in the last week, I have already injected 500 doses of the vaccines.
Still, Lam admitted he couldn't guarantee patients that they can secure a vaccination even if he has enough jabs.
In such a short time, there are so many people doing the vaccination. So even if the storage is enough, but there's a problem about delivery of vaccines. Just like for my clinic, I should have enough doses in the storage, but they cannot deliver the doses to me because of the transport problem.
We've looked up a healthcare corporation with about 80 branches currently in operation, but its online systems show the bookings for flu vaccination in the coming 2 weeks are already full. Meanwhile, staff at another medical group say they have run out of flu jabs at all 40 of its clinics and are not currently taking reservations. New supplies might not be available till next year. Secretary for Food and Health Sophia Chan says her bureau is monitoring vaccination supplies in the city and may have to negotiate with drug manufacturers for more vaccines.
An elderly pro-democracy protester is back in Hong Kong after what she says was a harrowing ordeal on the mainland. Pinky Wong with more.
Really, very hard time for me. In my whole life, I never had such kind of terrible experience before.
Alexandra Wong, affectionately known as Grandma Wong, is an active protester. The permanent Hong Kong resident has often been spotted waving the Union Jack on the front line of rallies in Hong Kong. The 64-year-old told reporters today she was detained by mainland police on her way to her Shenzhen home from Hong Kong on August 14th last year. Wong said she was kept in custody in various centers for a month and a half, where she says she suffered mental abuse. She recalled one of the places she was kept had up to 26 people in a room of less than 200 square feet. The activist said she was interrogated almost every day about Hong Kong protests and was never told about what crime she was accused of.
Every day, 24 hours, and I scare something happen again. Perhaps I will be detained, and I will be back to the detention center. It's really make me always remember the terrible living in detention center.
Wong added she was sent to a 5-day patriotic camp in Shanxi last September. She was later told by mainland officers she was charged with pickering quarrels and provoking trouble. Wong was not allowed to return to Hong Kong until earlier this month. She says she was visited regularly by national security officers in her Shenzhen home, pending a trial that has yet to take place. Wong finally returned to Hong Kong on October 3rd and just finished 2 weeks of quarantine. She called for the release of the 12 activists who were intercepted at sea and arrested by mainland authorities in August as they tried to flee to Taiwan.
I hope the 12 Hong Kong youth can come back as soon as possible to come back Hong Kong. In Shenzhen, detention is for the young people. I think that is much more terrible than my experience there.
The Shenzhen Municipal Public Security Bureau could not be reached for comment. Pinky Wong, TVB News.
The parents of a female murder victim have made another appeal to the SAR government to set aside political concerns and help them get justice for their daughter. The Security Bureau says the bureau chief will write a personal letter to them, but the office maintains it can't forcibly bring murder suspect Chan Tong-kai to Taiwan for trial. Officials insist it's up to authorities in Taiwan where the killing happened. Chan says he is willing to turn himself in. The bureau says Taipei should speed up his entry permit and help improve cooperation. Overseas now, protesters gathered today at Bangkok's main train station as authorities in the city shut down transit systems and set up roadblocks. The demonstrations come after riot police dispersed thousands of activists in the Thai capital on Friday. The protesters have been defying a strict new state of emergency as they call for political reform. Daniel Rao with the latest.
All stations of Bangkok's elevated SkyTrain mass transit system were ordered closed Saturday afternoon in an effort to thwart further anti-government protests. A line of the underground MRT system was also shut as police blocked off several roads. Organisers have now called for their followers to meet at SkyTrain stations pending further instructions. Today's unrest marks the fourth straight day of anti-government rallies in Thailand's capital. Protesters took to the city's streets on Friday afternoon in the midst of a monsoon. Tensions in Bangkok have intensified since the recent implementation of a state of emergency. The measure was imposed after demonstrators heckled a royal motorcade earlier this week. The state of emergency outlaws public gatherings of more than 5 people and bans dissemination of news deemed to threaten national security. It also gives authorities broad powers, including detaining people at length without charge. Police used water cannons and charged at the crowd in a bid to break up Friday's protest. Journalists hit by the water jet said it caused a stinging sensation and was dyed blue to mark protesters for possible later arrest. Similar tactics have been used by police on protesters in Hong Kong. Law enforcement officials said several demonstrators, as well as police, were injured and 7 people were arrested. Friday's protests were among the latest in a movement that was launched in March. The student-led movement's original demands were new elections, democratic and monarchical reform, plus an end to intimidation of activists. They have now demanded that Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-o-cha be removed from office. The Prime Minister led a 2014 coup that toppled an elected government. Activists allege he was returned to power unfairly in last year's general election. Prayuth says he has no plans to resign and has done nothing wrong. He added his government hopes it can drop the state of emergency ahead of its normal 30-day duration if the situation improves quickly. Daniel Rao, TVB News.
The death toll from severe floods in Cambodia has climbed to 24. Tens of thousands have been evacuated after a tropical storm triggered flash floods, damaging 60,000 homes. Disaster officials say 19 of the country's 25 provinces are affected, with thousands of hectares of rice destroyed. Traffic is restricted on several main roads in the worst-hit province to avoid damaging their services. In the capital, Phnom Penh, police moved nearly 8,000 families to safer ground. Heavy rains are expected to continue over the weekend.
Back at home, an unwelcomed visitor has been removed from Chunwon, but first the 3-meter Burmese python had to be captured. A hiker spotted the reptile in a catchwater channel near Kwongpantin village at around 8 a.m. and called police. Snake specialists arrived and captured the creature, which appeared to be looking for food. The Burmese python is a protected species in Hong Kong and can be found across the city. Welcome back to TVB News. A day after holding dueling televised town halls, U.S. President Donald Trump and rival Joe Biden hit the campaign trail.
Trump's strategy was to paint Biden as a far-left candidate, while the former vice president focused on the White House's mishandling of the pandemic. Trump campaigned in Florida and Georgia, neighboring states he carried 4 years ago. Georgia is a Republican stronghold. No candidate from the GOP has lost this state since George H.W. Bush in 1992. During his rally, Trump tried to portray Joe Biden as unstable.
If he wins, the radical left will be running this country. They're addicted to power, and God help our country if that happens. I really mean it. You'll never make a comeback. It'll be a large-scale version of Venezuela. I've been saying that for a year, but I've never meant it like I mean it now.
During a stop in Florida, senior advisor Hope Hicks returned to the campaign trail with Trump more than 2 weeks after she tested positive for the virus. Hicks and the president were two of many people with links to the White House that contracted COVID-19. Neither wore masks. Democratic candidate Joe Biden made campaign stops in Michigan and focused on health care. The former vice president warned voters that Trump wants to scrap the 2010 Affordable Care Act, a move that could strip health insurance from tens of millions of Americans. Biden also took a shot at how Trump handled the coronavirus that has killed more than 200,000 Americans.
Another 200,000 lives are likely to be lost in the coming months between now and the first of the year. If we continue to refuse to follow science, because he refused to embracing wearing a mask. How many times on television do you see make fun of Biden wearing a mask? Because he refuses to practice social distancing. He puts his supporters in such jeopardy.
Biden didn't focus on the economy during his rally, but just released figures show under Trump, the federal budget deficit hit an all-time high of $3.1 trillion in the 2020 budget year. That's more than double the previous record as the coronavirus pandemic cut revenues and sent spending soaring. Incumbent New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has won a second term in office in an election landslide of historic proportions. Ardern's Labour Party collected nearly double the votes of the opposition National Party. This means they're on track to win 66 of the 120 seats in the country's parliament. Ardern could now form the first single-party government since the 1996 introduction of proportional representation. Her popularity soared earlier this year after her government successfully stamped out COVID in New Zealand. There's currently no community spread of the virus in the Pacific nation. New Zealand residents are no longer required to wear masks or social distance. Ardern was also praised for her handling of last year's attack on two Christchurch mosques.
Coronavirus cases are on the rise in Europe, with infection rates 3 times higher than when the pandemic took hold in March. The World Health Organization has taken notice and is voicing its concern.
It isn't just the increasing case numbers that we're seeing. It's the increasing in hospitalization and the increase in the number of individuals who are in ICU. We know of a number of cities across Europe where ICU capacity will be reached in the coming weeks. And that is concerning as we approach the flu season.
Meanwhile, new quick result coronavirus tests are on the way in the UK. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says they should be distributed and trialled across the country over the next few weeks. The UK is also seeing a spike in cases, and officials are debating placing some cities on the country's highest alert. The mayor of Manchester says he will not implement any of the measures unless his town is given more money. The new lockdown measures include bar closings and the banning of social gatherings.
Australia's Victoria State reported just one new case of COVID-19 and no deaths. With infections slowing, it's expected the region's largest city of Melbourne will ease restrictions. Melbourne has been under one of the world's longest lockdowns, 100 days. Angry caterers threw crockery at the Barcelona City Hall. Crockery, eggs and flour also chucked at the regional presidency. Workers there are protesting coronavirus closures. Bars and restaurants will be closed for 2 weeks in Catalonia amid one of Europe's sharpest resurgence of the coronavirus. Things a little more refined in Paris, where diners had one last chance to enjoy a late evening out. A nightly curfew will last at least a month in 9 regions across France to combat the second wave of COVID-19. The new restrictions mean restaurants will have to close by 9 p.m.
That's the news. Thanks for watching.
Bye for now.